Now we are going to discuss the future of English as a global language. So far, we have discussed why was it possible for English language to obtain the global the status as a global English. So we have talked about the English has proved useful not only for the native English speakers, but also for the non-native English speakers. Now we have another question. So will English continue to maintain its global status, or is it fated to follow the footsteps of the Latin or French language? So let's think about the Latin language. So Latin was so widely used under the Roman Empire, and also it was so widely used as a language of education up until the Renaissance period of 17th or 16th century. So few people had predicted Latin language will eventually be replaced with another language as a language of global language for education. How about French? French was so widely spoken and used as a norm of a polite society in 16th or 17th century in Europe. So at that time, the few people had predicted French would eventually be replaced by another language as a norm of a polite society and a language of diplomacy. So when you are looking back, the fate of decline that Latin or French languages, that we may wonder whether the English language will be able to continue to maintain its status as a common word language. So in order to answer to this question, that our textbook author, David Crystal, presents the 4 factors that can possibly limit or restrain the potential of English language to remain as a global language. So now we are going to talk about what are the 4 hindrances that will minimize the growth potential of English language as a word common language. The first hindrance is rejection of English. Some people in some countries, they can reject the use of English. Maybe that's because that is the language of their former colonial power, so they may well feel antagonistic against the English. And also, let's think about some writers and novelists and authors who are living in the outer circle countries, where the English is used as a foreign language or the secondary language. So these writers, they usually are in dilemma. They have to make a choice whether to write their books in English language or whether to write it on their local language. So this is the dilemma that one of the most outstanding authors in English literature, like James Joyce, faced. For example, if he had chosen his book in his own language, that it couldn't have reached the global fans worldwide, and also it couldn't have become the most influential literary figure in the history of English literature. So that's because he chose to write his novel in English, the global language. So this is the case that shows that the usefulness of English for the writers in the outer circle countries to write if they want to reach the global fans. However, if you are writing English, it also means that you must sacrifice your local identity. So this is the dilemma that often faces the choices between to achieve the global reach or just maintain our local identity. So we are curious what is the conclusion of our textbook author David Crystal on the impact of the rejection of English on the global status of English. His conclusion was the impact of this rejection would be insignificant to affect the position of English as a global language. And he concluded the impact is sufficiently small to weaken the status of English as a global language. So I wonder whether you agree with this author's point of view about the rejection of this English use. As we are done with the hindrance 1, let's move to the hindrance 2. The second hindrance was the wide use of regional lingua franca. So we have talked about regional lingua franca. For example, the Spanish is a regional lingua franca for most of the countries in Latin America. So, and also the Russian is the lingua franca for the countries that used to be the former colonies of the now extinct Soviet Union. And about Hindi? Hindi is the regional lingua franca for the people living in South Asia, like Bangladesh, India, Bhutan. And also, the Spanish Arabic is also regional lingua franca for the people who live in North Africa. And the use of this the regional lingua franca is still strong. So, in another word, so there is the regional lingua franca like Chinese or Russian or Spanish are so widely used, so can it weaken the position of English as a global lingua franca? That's the question. However, then we have another question: why the regional lingua franca is still strong? Because because their business are still operated on a regional basis. For example, if you are a businessman in Mexico, so you are trading with the only Colombian people or the Argentina people, and you don't have to spend the time and money trying to learn English as long as you do not have a business relationship with American or Europeans. You can just say Spanish. Spanish is enough for you to do business as long as your business is operated on a regional basis just within the Latin America. That's the example. So now that we must think about, there is another thing that can possibly reduce the use of regional lingua franca, because now the world economy is getting globalized. What does it mean? The Colombian economy should be more globalized. That means that they should be trading with someone in America or Europe or China or India. So as a result, they should eventually take English seriously as their foreign language or secondary language to learn. And we are also talking about the third hindrances. The third thing they can possibly weaken the status of English as a global language is there is a conflict between the need for the local identity and the need for intelligibility. So we have already talked about what is the language has to function. The one function is just to keep the language is used to express and strengthen the local identity, and the other function of the language is just to be able to communicate with the outer circle people or inner circle people. So if you belong to outer circle people, your English should be intelligible to their Englishes. In other words, this is the comprehension side of English. So when we are talking about intelligibility, we are talking about the need to learn and speak the standard English. On the other hand, if we are talking about the need for the local identity, we are talking about the varieties of English. In another word, that there are Asian varieties of English like Chinglish, Janglish, and Konglish. So this is the Asian variety of English. So there are two sides of English is there, and there can be a conflict between the two versions of English. This is the conflict. Maybe this conflict is so fragile, and the conflict is one reason can weaken the use of English as the world common language. So it's interesting to find that our textbook author, David Crystal, he suggests one solution to resolve this conflict. So what is it? It is the take it and eat it approach. So we have already talked about what is the take it and eat it approach. This is typically the Chinese way of using English. Take it means take English as standard English. You should be serious about using the standard English and studying the standard English. If you are serious about, if you are to use English as a career chances, if you want to be a lawyer, you want to address your international group of people at the international political forum, or if you want to be a professor, or if you want to do a business with Americans or Europeans, you should be serious about this comprehension side. In other words, your English should be intelligible enough to native speakers. Your English should be understandable. You must make yourself understood. If you speak English, you must make yourself understood, whether you are talking to native speakers, whether you are talking to Chinese people. So this is a very important part of the English. So take it and eat it. That means you should be able to learn and use two versions of English. When we are addressing the international meeting, for example, you should be fluently talking about standard English. On the other hand, if you are handling some local people, the Asian people or Chinese people or Indian people, then you should be able to comprehend their English, and you should also use communicating in Asian variety of Englishes. So let's take an example of this take it and eat approach. For example, in Singapore, there are two versions of English. The Singapore people, when they are doing business with Americans, then they should be able to use the standard English. But if the Singapore people, if they are speaking in another Asian people, or they are communicating among themselves, they should be also speaking their version of their variety of English is Singlish. So there are two versions of English, and so take it and eat it approach means that you are taking the both version of Englishes. So one is the need to keep the local identity, and also you need also the other is the need for the intelligibility with by learning the standard English. So that's why the English is becoming diglossic language. It means there are two spoken varieties of English. As I said, in Singapore, there are two versions of English. There are two spoken versions of English. One is the standard English, and the other is the Singlish. So in this regard, then we have kept asking the question, is there any other languages that might weaken or even replace the English language as the next lingua franca, so that we can develop the loyalty for another languages? So in this regard, that our textbook author, David Crystal, they offers a very interesting number. It's about the rate of native English speakers versus the native English speakers. And until the 1960s, the L1 speakers used to be bigger than the L2 speakers. In other words, there were a larger number of people who were speaking English as their mother tongue languages than those who were speaking English as their foreign language or secondary language. So it was only 5 decades ago, 6 decades ago, there was still L1 speakers. There were much more L1 speakers than the L2 speakers. In other words, there were much bigger the inner circle people than those who belong to the outer circle people. But there is an interesting reversal of this number during the past 5 decades. Now, the ratio reversed into 1 to 3 in favor of L2 speakers. In other words, there are much more L2 speakers than the L1 speakers. So this to say that there are a lot more people who are using English as foreign or secondary language than those who are speaking English as their mother tongue language. This is an interesting reversal of the numbers, and this number is very significant message. It gives a significant message to us because what it implies is the future, the fate of English depends not only on the hands of the native speakers, but also on the hands of the L2 speakers. I would even say that its fate depends more on those who are speaking English as foreign language or the secondary language. So which countries should we note when we think about the future destiny of English? I would say it's Brazil, or is it India, or China, and Indonesia. And these countries, there is a growing number of English speakers. So in the future fate of English depends on the outer circle people and the extending circle people. That's interesting indication that we have from our textbook author. And also, there is another hindrance. What is another hindrance? There are another factor that might possibly weaken the position of English as a world common language. That is a fragmentation of English into a lot of varieties. What does it mean, fragmentation? So, English used to be one language. It used to stay within British Island. Then, with the power of British empowered, it began to see the spread of English across the world. It was spread into America, spread into New Zealand, and it went to Africa, and it went to Asia. So, English is no longer possessed by its native speakers like British people or American people. And in other words, English is no longer in sole possession by the native speakers, British or American. This is what the textbook describes. So what is the result? English continues to fragment it into different varieties of English. So last class we talked about, for example, that is Pidgin and also Creole. What is Pidgin? So we talked about Pidgin. It's a simplified form of English, and that its primary purpose is just to communicate among themselves. We talked about also African slaves. They were put together from different positions into the same ship, and they came from all the different regions, and they were speaking different dialects, so they couldn't communicate each other. So only language available for them to communicate was English, but English was too difficult for them to learn, so they happened to develop very simple and easy version of English. That is a Pidgin. So the Pidgin is one example of a variety of English, and also they during their the African slaves, they used the Pidgin when they spoke to the crew members of the ship, and they spoke Pidgin with the other black slaves. It came from the different region, and during their voyage, the Atlantic crossing voyage, they developed the Pidgin language as the common language to communicate. So they finally arrived somewhere in America or somewhere in the Caribbean countries, and they just get down from the boat, and they was sold to a plantation, and they began to work on the plantation, and they have a white master to communicate, and also they have the other slaves to communicate, and they married there, and they bore the children, and they bore the babies, and their babies grew up, the children and the adults, and their babies, they continue to use the Pidgin. But what's the difference between Pidgin and Creole? Once the children, they begin to use the Pidgin as their mother language, the Pidgin, it was becoming the Creole. The Creole is a little bit more complicated as a version of Pidgin. So there is a lot of Creole. There is a lot of Creoles in the Caribbean, and also in the West Africa, there is a lot of Creoles speaking. The interesting part is the Creole is so different from standard English. So native speakers like American and British, they cannot understand the Creole language. They need Creole translators, whenever they travel to Caribbean or West Africa, they couldn't understand the Creole. However, it's interesting to note that the Creole speakers also counted as L1 speaker if they speak the Creole as their primary language. So if they speak the Pidgin or Creole as a secondary language, then they are counted as the L2 speakers. So that's interesting. So in this regard, so the fragmentation of English, so that could be the barrier for the maintenance of English as a global language, or that could be a facilitator. So that's the question we must discuss. So also another linguist, David Grado, he talked about a very interesting number. He said the share of the world population who are speaking English as a mother tongue, that will decline. It used to be 8% in 1950, but it will drop to 5% by 2050. So what does the number implies to the future? The English is no longer at the hands of L1 speakers. That means the fate of English is now depends on the hands of L2 speakers, because if so. So that's why we must note the trend of Creole and Pidgin, and the very populous countries like Brazil or India and China. So it'll be interesting for us to see how the India or China, how they are going to affect the use of English as global lingua franca. So that will be the next topic.